that the members of congregations do as well. In Carrollton, they get to listen to me all the time. And so during the summer, we invite a lot of different speakers in. I know you do that, and it's always, for me, enjoyable to get to go different places. And I know it's enjoyable for you to be able to hear different people. And not because you don't enjoy hearing Chad. Chad's a great friend of mine and is a faithful gospel preacher, and I love and appreciate him, and I know he does a great work with you, but I'm glad to get to be with you tonight. Be ye imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ. It's a great theme. There are a lot of Bible characters given to us, and one thing, when we start looking at multiple characters, we need to be careful about, and that is, if you're not careful, you'll take a series like this where maybe over this summer you'll get to hear 11, 12, 13 different speakers. One will be talking about one characteristic of one person. And if you're not careful, what we can do is we can listen to all of these characteristics given over the course of a summer, and we can start compiling that into one person. And the next thing you know, you start thinking, well, all these people have got all of these characteristics, and I don't have them like they do. And you begin to look down on yourself and beat yourself up. But remember that each one of these characteristics is being tied to one person, not to everybody. And not everybody in the Bible has all of the good characteristics to the degree that each one of these might have one. Let's remember that we're looking at human beings. We're not looking at superhumans. We're not looking at people who are above and beyond. We're looking at people who are everyday people, common people, but because of a characteristic, they stand out. And yes, we need to be working in all of these areas in good characteristics, as well as trying to stay away from the bad ones we see from the examples given in Scripture. But as we're working toward building a godly character with these characteristics, we need to remember that while we may shine in some areas, we may be deficient in others. That doesn't mean that's okay. It means we're a work in progress. We continue striving and working to be the best that we can be. And when we see someone with a great characteristic, it's good to note it. But let's remember that they also have their issues. They also have their flaws, their failings. And let's make sure we keep a good, balanced mindset about looking at so many characters, so many characteristics, and at who we are. Certainly we need to be working and building, but we don't need to get an unrealistic idea about the examples that are in front of us. Tonight we're going to be talking about suffering and enduring. The idea of tonight is not just about suffering, it's about the enduring through suffering. Job stands out not simply because he suffered, he stands out because he endured. In James chapter 5, as James is going through a section there talking about enduring through suffering, he says in verse 10, take for an example of suffering and enduring, of patience, perseverance, the prophets. These prophets of old stood up when they were suffering because of their stance. They stood up and spoke God's word. They spoke it when the people were receptive. They spoke it when they weren't receptive. Start making you think of another New Testament passage. You preach it when they likes it and preach it when they don't likes it. Marshall Keeble. He was talking about what Paul wrote to Timothy when he said, preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. We go back to the prophets, and James is writing by inspiration. Take those prophets as an example. They suffered because they were doing the right thing, and they did it well. But in verse 11, then he draws attention down to one man. Remember Job. You've heard of the patience, the perseverance of Job, the enduring of Job. So keep him set before you as an example. He is one who stands out. You know, the ones we use for examples, whether it's examples of good things or examples of bad things, are the ones that stand out. You know, we don't generally use for examples those who are just in the middle of the pack. We pick out the ones who are really outstanding, either in their good traits or in their evil traits. to use as the examples. That's why, as I talked about a character, building a whole Christian character, you need to be careful, understanding that one glowing character trait does not necessarily exemplify the entire of a person's character. When you go through Hebrews 11, what are you reading? You're reading about a lot of people who, some of them, in a moment, their faith stood out. Somebody tell me about the life of Samson. The great, faithful, godly life of Samson. No, you're not going to find that. You're going to find some unfaithfulness. You're going to find different direction to his life. But what is focused on in Hebrews 11 is a moment where he stood with faith. That doesn't mean because he's mentioned there that his life should be enshrined as a picture of godly faith. No, but that moment stands out, so we look at that moment. And with Job, I want us to be careful in realizing that Job's enduring during his suffering is more than just the moment. We're going to flip this around. It's more than just the moment. And we'll see that as we go through this. Why does Job stand out? Why does James mention him? Look at the prophets as a picture of faith during suffering, of enduring during suffering, and more specifically, look at Job, this one man, because of his patience in suffering, because of his enduring during this situation. Why does he stand out? Well, a few thoughts that we have about Job. He stands out because his suffering was extreme. You know, we read about other people in the Bible who suffered this or that. We don't read about anybody who goes through a suffering situation like Job does, as far as the extreme amount of suffering. Do you remember how Job is described in the opening of the book? First, it talks about him personally as far as his character, but then it starts talking about the picture that we would all have of someone when we think about them as their status. What was the status of Job? His family life, his wealth. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. You know, back in the time when Job lived, it was something that made you stand out if you had a lot of children. Especially if you had a lot of children and did well with them, raised them well, trained them well, taught them to be good citizens and good people and have good morals and godly people. You would stand out. And so Job was a standout because he had 10 children. And obviously, by what we continue reading, was doing well with them. Remember what it said by verse 5? He was so concerned about their spiritual welfare that he would think about when they had their times of feasting together, their birthdays, basically is what it's talking about, when they would all get together. And when they would get through that time, when it was all finished, he would go and make sacrifices for all of his children, because his thinking was, it may be, not I know they've done wrong, it may be that they've cursed God in their hearts. And so he sacrificed for them, and it said he did this regularly. So we're reading about Job and how great his children were to him and how he treated them. But then it begins to go through and lay out for us his wealth. He had 7,000 sheep. Now you think about today what it would mean if you had the herds and the flocks that Job had. Think about what that would mean to you. It's one thing to say, I've got 7,000 sheep. It's another thing to recognize there's a cost involved in obtaining those sheep, or obtaining the ones that kept giving birth and ending up with that many sheep. There's a cost involved in feeding them, making sure they're watered. Generally means you're going to either be buying or renting land that's good for pasture and good for water. And so it's a big expense. But hopefully in the long run, what happens is the numbers multiply. You're able to shear them often. You're able to eventually begin to sell some along until it becomes a trade. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. How many oxen is that? 2 per yoke. So that's 1,000. He's got 1,000 oxen. 500 yoke. He's got 500 female donkeys. Why are the females mentioned and not the males? only need one male for so many females for them to have offspring, to be able to either to use and work or to sell them, make money off of them. It's talking about wealth here. The wealth in this is having the females, 500 female donkeys. And then as it lays it out here, he says he also has a very large household. Well, it already said he has 10 children. And we read not too long after this about his wife. So they have 10 children. What does it mean, a very large household? That would include the servants, as sometimes they're referred to in Scripture, people who worked for him, people who worked for him full time, therefore they lived with them. It's like having the idea of the householder as well as everybody that works for them on a full-time basis living right there with them like family. So he had not only the 10 children, but they had a large household, a bunch of people that worked for him. Anybody that backed up and looked at Job as a whole picture would have looked at him and said, he's got it all. How does God refer to him? He was the greatest of all the people of the East. He was an outstanding man. We say that word sometimes, and I think we fail to recognize the meaning. Outstanding means they stand out. They stick out. When I was a kid, we'd say they stick out like a sore thumb. You know, you got the big swollen red thumb that you accidentally hit with a hammer. You aim for a nail and hit the wrong one, and it's all swollen up, and boy, that stands out. Everybody that walks by can see that. He stood out with his family, his household, with his animals, the wealth that he had. Remember, he had servants, people that worked for him. That doesn't mean, as you go through many of the Bible situations, it doesn't mean slavery. It's hired servants. It's people that work for him, and he pays them, and they live with his household. Now, watch what happens. As you go through this and see all that he has that made him outstanding, then it says, of course, we read the situation, the sons of God, obviously the angels, come before God to present themselves, and when Satan comes with them, he claims to have ownership of the earth. I've been on the earth walking to and fro and up and down it. This is my domain. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? Now, when God and Satan are having this discussion, Job is not involved. He is not aware. As far as we can tell, he doesn't know about any of this until after the situation. But what God does when Satan says, well, you've built a hedge around him. You've made everything he touches turn to gold. You've given him the Midas touch, and you protect him with this hedge so that nothing can bother. Of course he serves you. He serves you because, you ever heard this phrase? The gospel of prosperity. If you follow me, I'll give you, I'll bless you, I'll do for you. You'll never want, you'll never hurt, you'll never suffer. There are people that preach a gospel like that today. That's not a gospel that comes from God. He doesn't promise that. And Job had not received those promises. In fact, we see God telling Satan, go ahead. You think he'll turn on me if he doesn't have all of this stuff? Go ahead. You afflict his life, but you don't touch him. So what does Satan do? We read about the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans and the fire from God. And the next thing you're reading, and listen, don't lose this as you start to read this in chapter 1. A servant comes in and says, the Sabaeans came and they raided the animals and they killed all the servants, and I alone am escaped to tell you. Before he finishes speaking, the next servant comes in and says, fire from God came down and killed the animals and all the servants who were with him, and I alone am escaped to tell you. And before he finishes speaking, another servant comes in and says, the Chaldeans came and they raided and they carried off the animals and they killed all the servants. I alone am escaped to tell you. And before he finishes speaking, another servant comes in and says, all of your 10 children were gathered up at the oldest brother's house. They were celebrating, and this great wind came across from the wilderness and smote the four corners of the house, and it collapsed on them, and it killed your children and the servants. And I alone am escaped to tell you. 1, 2, 3, 4. Before one finishes, another one comes in to tell the next tale, the next loss, the next blow. And you've got a man who is receiving all of this news, who just a few minutes earlier would have been considered the greatest man of all the people of the East. And now his animals, his servants, that great household, his children are all gone. And we read that Job is torn apart. He's doing what anybody would do in that situation. He is broken. He's experiencing such grief that all he can do is tear his robe and shave his head, and the outpourings of grief, are they really fitting to tell the story of the grief that's being felt? When someone sees you have loss and they see your tears, do those tears really tell the story? They let someone know that you're suffering, that you're grieving, but it doesn't give them the extent. If they see you dressed in sackcloth and ashes, as many did back in Bible times, if they see your wailing, if they see your tears, if they see you not being able to function, they see you closed up at home, they see you shut up from the world, they know that you're suffering. That may even tell them to what degree, in a sense, you're suffering, that it's some suffering or it's very bad suffering. That still doesn't tell them the story, does it? We know that he suffered a great deal because right off the bat we begin to read about what the suffering was. But you know that suffering that Job was feeling, while the extent of it, the greatness of it may stand out, he doesn't stand out just in the fact that he suffered. You know who else suffers? All of us. How many other Bible characters do we read about who suffered? He had a lot of suffering. Was his suffering greater or worse than others who suffered similar things, maybe not all at once, but maybe here and here and here in life? Job doesn't stand out because he suffers. Maybe in one sense because he suffers so much all at once. But everybody suffers. Well, okay, maybe we find an answer also in chapters 1 and 2 in that Job not only suffered, but his support system was greatly lacking. You know, everybody talks today about your support system. Who do you have around you when you start to suffer who's going to be able to help you to go through your suffering? Nobody can take your suffering away. You know, sometimes people will say, well, that's been a little while, you need to get past it. You need to get over it. No, you don't ever really get past or get over things that make you suffer a great deal. What you do is you live through it and you continue to live. So that you have life that was before that, you had life during that, and you have life beyond that. But you don't really just get over it. You don't turn a page and now that's behind me and it's gone. If it is a great suffering, it has made its mark and it's always going to be there. You learn to keep living. You don't get over it, get past it, and just move on and leave it behind. It's part of your life. It's part of your history. It's part of who you are today. And it's there. And what are you learning to do every day from that moment on? Is you're learning to live with that in your life. You're learning to keep on going, to carry a burden and suffer. And what helps us in some instances can be the people that are around us, the people who love us, the people who care, the people who extend open arms, the people who want to hold your hand and walk forward with you, the people who will be a shoulder for you to cry on when necessary and lean on when necessary. It's important. Support system is important. what did Job have? Who did Job have? Well, his 10 children are gone. His servants, his large household, with the exception of 4 who came back to tell him of each of the losses, have been killed or wiped out along with the animals when the animals were being carried off. His wife is there. And before we throw Job's wife under the bus, because that happens a lot, she just lost 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 she-donkeys and a great household and 10 children. She just lost everything Job did. So let's not just throw her out and treat her like she's out of her mind. You know what? She may be a little bit out of her mind at this point. Just like Job. Because she's just lost he was the greatest of all the people of the East. Well, guess who else was right there with him? She was. She was just as great as he was. She would have been noted in the same way as her husband. And now she's lost everything. And we read, of course, one of the losses we didn't talk about. I don't want to move on too fast. One of the losses we didn't talk about was Job's health. Remember, first God told Satan, you can touch his life, but don't touch him. Then in their second discussion at the beginning of chapter 2, he says, okay, you can touch him, but don't kill him. I love how we see the picture here, that God and Satan are not equals. That God is the creator. He is the Almighty. He is the sovereign one. He allows Satan to go so far, and he puts a line down and says, don't touch him. Now he says, you can touch him, but you can't kill him. He keeps Satan in a fence. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can't do. And so Satan touches Job physically so that he has boils from the soles of his feet, the bottom of his feet, to the crown of his head. We'd say from top to bottom. He's covered with boils to such an extent that he's sitting among the ashes with a broken piece of pottery scraping his boils. Awful situation. And his wife says, do you still retain your integrity? You're still going to hold on to God? Her assumption, her thought is, God has turned on you. So the very natural follow-up to that is, you turn on God. Curse God and die. Well, he's not going to get the support that he should be receiving from someone, from the woman who's suffering right there with him. She's lost all of these things. She's lost her children, and her husband's health is to such a point that apparently both of them assume he's not going to make it through this. So she's saying to him, just go ahead and curse God and die. His friends come. And oh, when his friends come at the end of chapter 2, it's a beautiful thing. They have made a plan. They made, we think of an appointment. They got together so they could all come and be there at the same time. And it's obvious they care about Job. They see him as they're approaching from a long way off. When they see him, they don't even recognize him. And they start weeping. They care about him. They feel for him. And when they get to where he is, they come in and they sit down on the ground in his presence, and they sit there for 7 days and do not open their mouths because they see how terrible his grief is. These are some good friends to have. And then Job opens up and starts talking about how he feels about the situation. He starts to curse the day he was born, wishing he could die, wishing he could just be alleviated of all of this pain and suffering and stress and everything he's under. And when he finally finishes that opening speech, his friends start talking. You've got Eliphaz, you've got Bildad, you've got Zophar, and they take turns. One of them speaks, Job answers. The next one speaks, Job answers. The next one speaks, Job answers. And you go through rounds of speeches that make up the most of the body of the book of Job. And you remember what his friends were telling him the whole time? They never varied from this. Job, when you were faithful to God, God blessed you abundantly. Look at all that you have had. Look at who you were, how everybody considered you because you were faithful, and God gave you all of this. Obviously, now something has changed. What has changed is you have done something terribly wrong before God, and now God is throwing you away. If you'll repent, He'll bless you again. He'll change it, and you'll be having all these things again. And what did Job do the whole time? Job did not say, he never said, I'm perfect, I'm flawless, I've never done anything wrong. No, he admitted through his speeches, of course I have sinned, but I've always been faithful. I've sacrificed, I've done what I needed to do. I've obeyed God. Even when I sinned, I still continued to obey God. So it's not right that God's turning on me because I'm a sinner. Now, we understand that Job suffered a great deal. I don't think he stands out as much in his suffering. Maybe in this sense of his support system, but are there other people that suffer in this world, in the Bible that we read about, or today in the world, who don't have a good support system? Who don't have people around them to help them through the tough times? Of course there are. So that wouldn't make him stand out necessarily either that much, but maybe we ought to be looking a little bit further. Job did suffer tremendously, and he suffered tremendously without anybody right there to hold his hand and help him. The ones who were around him were telling him, curse God and die. It's all your fault. Obviously, you've done something to offend God. You need to correct that. Then God will bless you again. Well, let's look at one more thing then. What makes Job stand out in his suffering? What makes him stand out is that he endures. But what do you mean he endures? Are there other people who suffer, who live beyond the suffering? We're not talking about physical enduring. Obviously, this is mostly adults. We got a few young ones here, but mostly adults. And some of us are pretty old as adults. Have you suffered before? I'm going to say I'm sure you have. I'm sure some of you have suffered a lot in your life. And at least at this point, you've lived through it. We're not talking about physically. He endured spiritually. You know, in James chapter 1, James points out that you could understand and consider yourself blessed of God when you fall into various kinds of trials. How many of you, when a trial presents itself, when you are made to suffer in some way, how many of you start jumping up and down and saying, yes, I'm so glad another trial has come my way? No, that's not our reaction during the trial. Maybe after the trial. Because he says, knowing that the trying of your faith produces patience. Understand that because you have gone through something and gone through it well, then your faith is going to grow. Your strength is going to grow. Your endurance is going to grow. I understand that I'm not in the best running shape. You probably understand that too, just looking at me. There was a time when I could get out and run for miles. But I didn't just wake up one morning and say, you know what, I think I'll go run 10 miles today. First, I had to go run a half mile, and then build up to a mile, and then up to 5 miles, and then up to 10 miles. And I could do it. There was a time when I could just take off anytime I wanted and go run 10 miles. And it wasn't a big problem. I'd do it, I'd be tired, but I could come back home and do other things. If I had to run 10 miles today, I'd get the first half in and pass out. You know what that's talking about? It's talking about training to build up endurance. And that's exactly what James is talking about. You're going to go through the training, the trials, and if you go through them well, not just if you go through them, not everybody who suffers is strengthened to better suffer the next time. It's the ones who suffer with faith, the ones who suffer with endurance, the ones who hold on to God through the suffering, who then are strengthened to be able to suffer better at another time. When we read about Job, we're reading about a man who is suffering through this difficulty, but I want us to understand he's enduring through this difficulty. He's holding on to God. What does he say at the end of chapter 1? When he loses all of these things, when his 10 children are dead, he's tearing his clothes, he's shaving his head, he's mourning, he's grieving, he's hurting, and he says, "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away." God has blessed me with all of these things, and today God has taken them all from me. What's the next phrase? Blessed be the name of the Lord. In the second chapter, when his wife is saying to him, "Are you going to retain your integrity? Curse God and die." What does he say to his wife? Should we not receive good from the Lord and not also receive adversity? And in all this, Job did not sin, nor did he charge God foolishly or charge God with doing wrong. Now, I want us to understand something. Job never turned on God. He never gave up on God. He never had an attitude throughout this situation of, God is doing this to me and therefore I don't like God anymore. He never had that. He did have the first half of that through this whole thing. God is doing this to me. Was he right? Was God doing it to him? Only, if you want to consider it, only indirectly by allowing Satan to do it. But God is not the one actively pursuing the destruction of Job. He's not. God was fine with Job, and Job was fine with God. It was when Satan sees Job, when God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And Satan says, "Let me put my bullseye on him." And God says, "Okay, you can do this much, but that's all." And then says, "You can go a little bit further, but that's all." God allows it to happen, but Satan leaves God and goes to do it. He's the one who goes and attacks Job's life and then attacks Job's health. It's not God doing it, but Job's understanding through this whole scenario is that God has blessed me with all of these good things, and now God is systematically removing them from me. Job has a misunderstanding. He has the same misunderstanding that his wife has. He has the same misunderstanding that his friends have. The difference is they're pointing it in different directions. If you would, think of a triangle. It has 3 points. At the top point, you write God's justice. At a lower point here, you write Job's faithfulness. And at the third point, you write the belief that suffering comes only because of sin. The gospel of prosperity says, if I do well with God, He's going to give me things and stuff and health, all physical. And therefore, the opposite of that is, if I don't do well before God, He'll take all the things and the health, all physical. Job's friends are questioning, got your triangle, Job's friends are questioning Job's righteousness. They are attacking Job's righteousness before God. Job, the whole time he's defending himself, is questioning. He's not attacking God like they did, but he's questioning God's justice. How can God be treating me this way? His friends say, we know how He's treating you this way. You're not righteous. You're a sinner. You're wicked. So God is destroying you. Job is recognizing, I am not an active sinner. I'm faithful to God. So why is He still destroying me? He's questioning God's justice. It's not until God begins to speak toward the end of the book, when there's several chapters of God laying out to Job, remember who I am and remember who you are before me. It's not until God begins to speak that anybody begins to question the belief system that suffering comes only because of sin. Now, does suffering sometimes come because of sin? Yes. But do the righteous suffer too? In ways that are not brought about because of their own personal sin. Do righteous people suffer sometimes because of somebody else's sin? Yeah. Persecution. Somebody's doing the right thing and suffers because they are doing the right thing. Remember, Peter writes about that. He says, when you suffer for righteousness' sake. That doesn't mean you're a righteous person and you happen to be suffering. You know, if a flood comes in the area where you live, everybody suffers from that flood. You're not suffering as a Christian there. Understand what I'm saying? You're not suffering because you're a Christian. You are a Christian who is suffering. But the worldly person that lives down the street is also suffering the same thing. So you're not being singled out because you are a Christian and made to suffer because you are a Christian. But there are times when Christians suffer because they are Christians. Because somebody doesn't like the fact that they stand up for what's right, that they practice what's right, that the right living shines a bad light on them. We suffer sometimes just because we live in this world. COVID-19 has caused a lot of problems for a lot of people. And it didn't care if you were righteous or unrighteous. Cancer has bothered a lot of people in this world. And it doesn't care if you're righteous or unrighteous. It's a disease, it's a sickness, it's a health issue, it's a problem. We understand some suffering is just there because we live in this world. So the belief system was a problem. It was a problem for Job's wife. It was a problem for Job's friends. It was a problem for Job. They attacked Job's righteousness. Job questioned God's justice. And finally, when God begins to speak and lay out these things to help them understand, I'm God and you're not. You don't have control of everything. You don't have everything under your thumb and in your hands the way that I do. So you should not think that you have all of this wrapped up in this belief system that's obviously flawed. Did Job suffer? Yes, he did. And he suffered a lot all at once. But there are other people that suffer tremendously too. That's not really what makes him stand out. Did Job's support system fall down on him? Yes. But other people go through that same scenario. What makes Job stand out is that he suffered as much as he did without the help that he should have been able to have with the people around him. And he still trusted God. Even though he was mistaken and thinking, God's the one doing this to me, he still did not fail to trust God. And when God spoke to him toward the end of the book, what we see Job doing is listening to God, not saying, well, you've already hurt me too much, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. He listens to God. He is appropriately abashed at his bold attitude of saying, I would like to stand before God and hear Him give me an answer about all of this. I would like for God to tell me why this is happening and why I'm suffering in this way and what's going on here. He said that to his friends, but when God started speaking to him, you know what Job did? He didn't attack God. He didn't try to put God in his place. God started out telling Job, remember who I am and who you are. Remember your position before me. Remember that I created all of these things, including you, that these are all in my hands. And Job listened to God, and he was humbled as he listened to God. And when God talked to Job, Job learned. He listened. He grew in his understanding. And let's see a picture of Job's faithfulness. You know, this is a big point to remember of why Job stands out. Job stands out because he's faithful. But not because he's faithful during the time of suffering. It's because he's faithful throughout. He was faithful to God before the period of suffering. You know, many times people want to live their lives selfishly, what I want, how I want to do things. And then when they suffer, I'll turn to God. God will take care of my suffering. No, He won't. Not if that's the way you live your life. If you live your life apart from God and then you suffer and want to turn to God, you still don't have God in your suffering. You may think you do, but you don't. Job had God already. So when the period of suffering came, he still had God. Remember how Job was described before the suffering? He was a perfect and upright man who feared God and shunned evil. He was a faithful man of God. When the suffering came, he was still a faithful man of God. When the suffering passed, he was still a faithful man of God. You want to have God with you during your times of suffering? Then you have God before the suffering, and you still hold on to God after the suffering. It's not about turning to God at the time of hurting. It's about continuing to hold to God during the time of hurting, because you're already holding to Him. You just continue to hold to Him, and you continue to hold to Him throughout the problem and beyond the problem, so that God is with you all the time. If He's not with you all the time, you can't pick and choose when He's going to be there. He won't show up for the suffering. He's either there with you or He's not. And that's what makes Job stand out. He was a faithful man of God before the suffering. He was faithful man of God during the suffering. And what about at the end? Do you remember the hope that the friends had when all this was over? Chapter 42. Beginning in verse 7, it says that the friends were talked to by God. After he'd been talking to Job for several chapters, he talks to the friends and he tells them, you bring sacrifices and you go to Job. And when Job prays for you, then I'll take care of you. How'd you like to be in those shoes? The man that you've been beating up for so many chapters of writing, now your forgiveness before God is depending on Him. Kind of a pickle, isn't it? And it tells you the kind of person Job was, because his friends came to him and Job prayed for them so that they could be forgiven by God. He was a faithful man all the way through the life that we're reading about. Probably about 70 years old when we begin to read about him. And you may be thinking, where do you get that? It never says he's 70 years old. In chapter 42, it says God doubled everything that he had. He had twice as many sheep, twice as many camels, twice as many oxen and donkeys. He got 10 children. You say, wait a minute, that's not twice as many. He already had 10 children. He still has 10 children. Out of all those things that he lost, what happened to those children? Well, they died. Did they disappear? Did they cease to exist? No. So when he had 10 more children, that doubled his children. He had 10 that were gone from this life, but still existed, and now 10 more. So now he has 20 children. And it says he lived a long life. God blessed him with 140 more years. If he doubled everything else, it's a likelihood that, seeing his stage of life and his wealth and his family, he was probably 70 and God gave him double that in further time, which would mean 210 years. It's a long time to live. It's a long time to live as a faithful person of God. That's what made him stand out. He belonged to God through the whole situation. Let's hold on to God no matter what's going on in our lives. And then when we do face troubles, He'll be there with us. Thank you all for your time and your attention tonight.